made a mistake, and I knew it the moment I handed Raymond the spare key to my house. Not because he was a bad man, at least that's what I told myself. He was my son-in-law. My daughter Sylvia had loved him for 3 years before they married. And when she looked at him, she had the same look her mother used to have when she looked at me. That kind of thing makes a man want to believe, so I believed. But something about Raymond had always sat wrong with me. The way a splinter under skin doesn't hurt enough to stop you, but never quite lets you forget it's there. My late wife Eleanor used to say I had a nose for trouble. She didn't mean it kindly. She meant I worried too much, that I saw shadows in places where there was only dust. Maybe she was right. She was right about most things. Eleanor passed 4 years ago. Breast cancer, stage 3, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. After that, it was just me and the house on Aldercroft Lane in Asheville, North Carolina. The house we'd bought together in 1989 when this whole part of town was still mostly farmland. 3 bedrooms, a covered porch, a garden she'd planted herself out back that I still couldn't bring myself to pull up, even when the weeds took over. Sylvia worried about me living alone. She called every Sunday, drove up from Charlotte at least once a month. She was good that way, always had been, even as a kid. When she told me she'd been seeing someone, I asked the normal questions. What does he do? Where's he from? Is he kind to you? She said he was a project manager for a construction firm, that he'd grown up in Raleigh, and that yes, he was very kind. She said it the way young people say things. They believe completely, without any room left for doubt. I met Raymond at a restaurant in Charlotte, a Sunday brunch Sylvia had arranged like it was a peace summit. He was tall, broad-shouldered, good-looking in that easy way that makes people trust men they shouldn't. He had a firm handshake and called me sir twice in the first 5 minutes. He asked about my career. I'd spent 31 years as a civil engineer with the state, and he listened, or pretended to listen, with the kind of focused attention that is either genuine respect or a performance of it. I couldn't tell which. I still can't, looking back. What I noticed, and filed away without mentioning to Sylvia, was the way his eyes moved around the restaurant when he thought no one was watching. Not nervously, assessingly, like he was cataloging things. The price of the steaks on the menu. The watch on the wrist of the man at the next table. My shoes. My car in the parking lot when we walked out. He was a man who was always quietly calculating. I told myself it was nothing. Lots of people are like that. I told myself I was being an overprotective father, suspicious of any man who came near his daughter. I'd been accused of that before, back when Sylvia was in college, and the accusation had been fair. So I kept quiet. They got married 18 months later in a small ceremony outside Brevard. Sylvia wore Eleanor's pearl earrings and cried during the vows. I held it together until the reception, then stepped outside behind the venue and stood in the dark for a few minutes by myself. Raymond found me there. He put a hand on my shoulder and said, "She talks about you all the time, you know. Everything good." I thanked him. I almost meant it. They moved into a house in the Dilworth neighborhood of Charlotte. A nice house, nicer than what a project manager's salary should easily cover. But I didn't ask questions. Young people have different ways of financing things now. I knew that much. The first time something concrete troubled me was about 8 months after the wedding. Sylvia mentioned, casually, that Raymond thought it might make sense for them to be added to my bank accounts, just as a precaution, she said, in case something happened to me and bills needed to be paid. She framed it as his idea, but I could hear her voice carrying his words. They didn't quite fit her mouth the same way her own did. I said I'd think about it. I didn't think about it. I noted it. Then, 3 months after that, Raymond brought up my will during a dinner at their house. Not crudely, carefully. He said he'd been reading about estate planning, that a lot of people my age didn't realize how complicated probate could get without proper preparation, that he wanted to make sure Sylvia was protected. He suggested a lawyer he knew, a guy named Fowler who had an office in South Park. I thanked him for his concern. I wrote down the lawyer's name on a notepad and put it in my shirt pocket. On the drive home to Asheville, I threw the notepad in a gas station trash can. I want to be honest about something. At this point, I still was not certain. What Raymond was doing could have been genuine. Son-in-law worries about elderly father-in-law alone in a mountain town. That's not a crime. That's reasonable. I had no proof of anything. I had a feeling, and a feeling isn't a fact. But I am 67 years old. I spent 3 decades working alongside engineers and contractors and project managers, and I know how a man behaves when he is doing careful work versus when he is doing work he doesn't want anyone to look at too closely. Raymond had that second energy. Every suggestion he made about my finances arrived wrapped in concern for Sylvia, for my well-being, for our family's future. The wrapping was always slightly too neat, so I started paying attention differently. I began mentioning things, small things, to see where they landed. I told Sylvia over the phone that I was thinking about updating my investment accounts, that I'd been talking to a broker at Edward Jones about shifting some things around. 3 days later, Raymond called me, unprompted, to ask how the meeting had gone. I had never told him there was a meeting. I'd only mentioned it to Sylvia. He covered smoothly when I pointed out the inconsistency, said Sylvia must have mentioned it, but I heard the half-second of recalibration in his voice. Then I started leaving things slightly wrong on purpose. I have a filing cabinet in the second bedroom I use as an office. Nothing in it is particularly valuable. Old tax returns, insurance documents, the original deed on the house, warranties for appliances I've had for 15 years. But I arranged it as though something important was there. I left a folder labeled AC Count Transfers 2024 near the front, visible if someone opened the top drawer. Inside it were printouts I'd made from a generic banking template I found online. Meaningless numbers, fake account names, nothing real. I told Raymond, during one of his visits, that I'd been moving some money around for tax purposes. I mentioned the filing cabinet in passing, the way you'd mention where you keep your stamps. 2 weeks later, I came home from my Wednesday morning walk to find the top drawer of the filing cabinet not quite closed. I always leave it closed. I have a habit from 30 years of professional work. I close things when I leave them. The drawer was open by perhaps an inch. I stood in the doorway of that office for a long time. I didn't confront him. I didn't call Sylvia. I sat down at my desk and I thought about Eleanor. About what she would have told me to do. She would have said, be sure first, don't blow up your daughter's marriage on a hunch and an open drawer. Be sure. So I took steps. I have a neighbor, a retired Charlotte Mecklenburg detective named Sutton, who moved up to Asheville after his divorce 5 years ago. We play chess on Thursday evenings and have dinner at the diner on Marymount Avenue about once a month. He is one of the most methodical men I have ever known. I told him what I'd been observing. I did not exaggerate. I told him exactly what I'd seen and heard, and I told him what I suspected. Sutton listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You haven't done anything wrong yet? Don't." He helped me set up a small, inconspicuous camera, the kind people use for doorbell security, positioned in a way that covered my office door and filing cabinet. He also helped me understand something I hadn't known. Under North Carolina law, if Raymond accessed my financial documents or accounts without authorization, it could constitute a felony, even if he was family. I also called my actual attorney, a woman named Patricia Holm, who had handled Eleanor's estate. I told her I was updating some things. She was thorough, professional, and entirely unsurprised by my concerns about family members and estate documents. She said she'd seen it many times. We made some changes. Nothing dramatic. Just some clarifications in language that ensured nothing could be altered without my explicit written consent witnessed by a third party. And I called my bank. I spoke to a branch manager I'd known for years and had a quiet conversation about what kinds of alerts could be placed on my accounts. Then I waited. I am a patient man. 31 years of engineering teaches you that the weakest point in any structure is not always visible from the outside. You have to apply steady pressure in the right place and wait to see where it gives. Raymond and Sylvia came to visit the first weekend of October. It was a normal visit. I cooked a roast. We watched a football game. They stayed the night in the guest room. Nothing felt different on the surface. On Saturday afternoon, I told them I was going to take a nap, that the drive the previous week had tired me out more than usual. I mentioned my back. I shuffled a little as I walked to the bedroom. Raymond watched me go. I felt his eyes. I did not sleep. I lay on top of the covers with my phone and watched the feed from the camera in my office. At 2047 in the afternoon, the door to my office opened. Raymond came in alone. He stood for a moment in the doorway, looking down the hall toward the bedroom. Then he went to the filing cabinet. He did not hurry. He pulled open the top drawer with the ease of someone who had done it before, which of course he had. He found the folder labeled AC Count Transfers 2024 and opened it. He photographed several pages with his phone. He returned the folder, closed the drawer to the approximate position it had been, slightly open as he'd found it, maintaining the illusion, and left the room. The whole thing took 4 minutes and 11 seconds. I stayed on my bed until I heard the television in the living room. Then I made the sound of a man waking up, cleared my throat loudly, and came out in my socks asking if anyone wanted coffee. I did not say anything that evening or the next morning. I made breakfast, hugged my daughter at the door, shook Raymond's hand, and told them to drive safe. Raymond looked at me with that assessing quality I'd noticed at the restaurant 3 years ago. Checking, I think, to see if there was anything wrong. There wasn't. I gave him nothing. When they pulled out of the driveway, I went inside and sat at the kitchen table for a while. I thought about Sylvia. She was not in on it. I was almost certain of that. She is her mother's daughter, which means she is constitutionally incapable of the kind of sustained deception Raymond practiced, which she was, I believed, was a woman who loved a man and had not yet been given reason to see him clearly. That was not her fault. That was something that happens to good people. I thought about what I owed her. Not protection from the truth. She was 41 years old. Not a child, but a fair chance to hear it from me before it became something she had to read off a police report. I thought about Raymond. I did not feel angry exactly. What I felt was something colder and more settled. He had looked at my daughter and seen a door. He had looked at me and seen an obstacle to be managed. He had come into my house, into my office, and photographed documents he had no right to. Documents he believed contained the map to a fortune he intended to claim by slow, careful maneuvering. He had done all of this while eating my food and calling me sir. He had not at any point considered the possibility that the old man with the bad back might be watching. I gave it 3 more weeks. I wanted to see how he intended to use the photographs. The answer came in the form of a phone call from my bank. The alert system I put in place flagged an inquiry. Someone had called the bank's general line and attempted to get information about my accounts, claiming to be my son-in-law calling on my behalf with my authorization. The branch manager called me personally. She was careful and professional. She told me no information had been released. She asked how I'd like to proceed. I told her I'd like to proceed carefully, and I thanked her. Then I called Sutton. Then I called Patricia home. We agreed that the time had come. The following Saturday, I invited Raymond and Sylvia for what I said was an early Thanksgiving gathering. Just us, I said, before the holiday got complicated with other plans. I cooked a turkey breast and made Sylvia's favorite sweet potato casserole, the one with the brown sugar and pecans Eleanor used to make every November. I set the table with the good china. During dinner, I was warm and a little scattered in the way I had been performing for months. I mentioned my memory being not quite what it was. I asked Raymond a question about the house that I'd asked him before, as though I'd forgotten his answer. He was patient and kind about it. He was very good. After dinner, while Sylvia was in the kitchen with the dishes, I told Raymond I'd been thinking about what he'd said regarding estate planning. I told him I'd been looking through my files and I thought I might have some paperwork ready for that lawyer he'd mentioned, Fowler. I said I'd been confused about some of the account numbers, that the documents in my filing cabinet weren't making sense to me the way they used to, and that maybe I could use his help sorting through them. I watched him. Something shifted very slightly in his face, a tightening at the corners of his eyes, a suppressed alertness. He said he'd be glad to help. I led him to the office. I opened the filing cabinet. I handed him the folder labeled OK Count Transfers 2024. He opened it. He went through the first page, then the second. His face was neutral and concentrated. Then something changed. His hand slowed. He went back to the first page. He looked at the account numbers again. He looked at the institution names. None of it matched what he photographed 3 weeks earlier. I had replaced all of it the day after his October visit. The new documents were different numbers, different formats, internally inconsistent in ways that would only be visible to someone comparing them to what they'd photographed before. They made no sense as a financial picture. They were a map to nothing. He looked up at me. "Something wrong?" I said. He said, "No, these numbers don't look quite right to me." "Don't they?" I said. "In what way?" He didn't answer right away. Sylvia appeared in the doorway. She'd finished with the dishes. I said, "Your husband was just helping me look at some account documents. He mentioned there was something that didn't look right to him." Sylvia looked at Raymond. Raymond looked at me. I left my phone on the desk, screen up. I turned it so Sylvia could see it. On the screen was the footage from October, Raymond alone in my office, opening the filing cabinet, photographing the documents. The timestamp in the corner read 2047 p.m. The silence in that room lasted a long time. Sylvia did not cry right away. That surprised me. She looked at the phone, and then she looked at Raymond, and what was on her face was not grief yet. It was the expression of someone reorganizing everything they thought they knew, fitting new information into old frames, finding that nothing lines up the way it did before. It was a look I recognized. I had worn it myself, in smaller ways, many times over the years. Raymond tried several things. He said the footage didn't show what it looked like. He said he'd been curious, not malicious. He said he'd been worried about me and had wanted to understand my financial situation better so he could help. He said it calmly, fluently, the way a man says things he has mentally rehearsed as contingencies. Sylvia said very quietly, "Stop." He stopped. She looked at me. She asked if there was more. I told her about the bank inquiry. I showed her the branch manager's follow-up email, which I had printed and kept in a separate folder in a different location. I showed her the notes I'd kept, dated since the first time Raymond had suggested being added to my accounts. I had written everything down: dates, conversations, what was said, what it suggested. 31 years of engineering. You document what matters. I want to be clear about what I did not do. I did not tell Sylvia what to do with her marriage. I did not tell her Raymond was irredeemable or that there was only one path forward. I told her what I had seen and what I had documented. The decisions were hers to make. She asked Raymond to go wait in the car. He went. He knew, I think, that the architecture of what he'd built had collapsed, that the math no longer worked in his favor. He left quietly. Sylvia sat with me at the kitchen table for a long time after he left. It was the same table where she'd eaten breakfast as a child, where Eleanor and I had helped her with homework in the 3rd grade, where we'd opened presents on Christmas mornings before she was old enough to be cynical about mornings. She didn't say much. I didn't say much either. I made tea. We sat. At some point she said, "I didn't know." I told her I knew that. She said, "Did Mom ever—" And then she stopped herself, because she already knew the answer. Eleanor had known before I did. Eleanor had pulled me aside at the engagement party just for a moment and said 2 words, "Be careful." I hadn't told Sylvia that until now. I told her. She nodded slowly like it fit somewhere she'd already made room for it without realizing. Raymond moved out of the Dilworth house by December. The divorce proceedings were not pleasant, but they were, at least, clarifying. Patricia Holm referred Sylvia to a good family attorney. The financial inquiry to my bank didn't rise to the level Raymond's attorney chose to contest, which was its own kind of answer. He agreed to terms that left Sylvia in the house and left him with the debts he'd accumulated. Sylvia came back to Asheville for Christmas. It was the 2 of us, the way it had been for the past 4 years. We cooked together. The turkey, the sweet potato casserole, Eleanor's green bean dish with the crispy onions on top, and we watched old movies and she slept in the guest room, and in the morning we sat on the covered porch in the cold with our coffee, not talking much, watching the light come up over the mountains. At some point she said, "You didn't tell me. For months you knew, and you didn't tell me." "I wasn't sure enough yet," I said. "I wanted to be sure." She was quiet for a moment. And the camera? Sutton helped me with it. She laughed a little, a short sound in the cold. Of course he did. We sat for a while longer. Eleanor would have known the first time she shook his hand, Sylvia said. She did, I said. My daughter looked at me. Then she looked out at the mountains. Yeah, she said. I know. The light kept coming up. The garden in the back, the one Eleanor had planted, was dormant now, under the frost. But it would come back in April the way it always did. Stubborn and particular, full of things my wife had chosen and placed with care. I had learned over the years not to change it. Some things are built right the first time, and the best thing you can do is leave them alone and let them do what they were made to do. Sylvia put her hand on top of mine on the armrest. She didn't say anything. Neither did I. That was enough. I've had a lot of time to think about what Raymond actually believed when he walked into my office that Saturday afternoon. He believed I was a tired old man taking a nap. He believed the worst thing that could happen to him was that I'd wake up early. That's the thing about people who underestimate you. They don't just make one mistake. They build an entire plan on top of that mistake, and every step they take goes deeper into ground that was never as solid as they thought. I don't say that with satisfaction. I say it because it's true, and because I spent a long time asking myself how it got that far. Part of the answer is that I was slow to trust what I was seeing. I kept giving Raymond the benefit of the doubt not because the evidence wasn't there, but because I didn't want to be the kind of father who destroys his daughter's happiness on a hunch. That hesitation cost me months. But it also gave me something. By the time I acted, I was certain. And certainty, when you finally have it, is worth being patient for. What I kept coming back to, and still do, is the difference between being good and being careful. I think a lot of people, myself included for most of my life, assumed those two things were in tension. That being careful meant being suspicious, and that good people didn't operate that way. Raymond counted on that assumption. He counted on the idea that a decent man wouldn't set a trap for his own son-in-law, wouldn't lie about his mental sharpness, wouldn't spend months quietly documenting every conversation. He thought decency and shrewdness couldn't live in the same person. He was wrong about that. Doing the right thing by Sylvia didn't mean being passive. It meant being sure before I spoke. It meant protecting her not just from Raymond, but from the kind of confrontation that blows up a marriage without enough evidence to justify the damage. Integrity isn't just about what you refuse to do. It's about how carefully you do what you have to. The patience it took, the months of watching, waiting, noting things down, keeping my voice steady at dinner while I already knew what I knew, that didn't come naturally to me. I'm not a patient man by temperament. Eleanor would have laughed at me claiming otherwise. But I learned it the way I learned most things worth knowing, by working with people who were better at it than I was, and by understanding what was at stake if I got it wrong. Sutton was patient. Patricia Holm was patient. I followed their lead and held my own course, and it held. And Sylvia. What she did sitting across from Raymond at that table and saying, "Stop with one word after 3 years of marriage." That took something I'm not sure I could have done at her age. She didn't fall apart. She didn't defend him out of habit or fear. She asked to see everything, and when she'd seen it, she made her decision and she held to it. Her mother would have done the same thing. Would have done it faster, probably. I think about the people who write in asking how you stay composed when you're exposing something like that. The honest answer is that composure isn't really the right word. What I felt in that office wasn't calm. It was the weight of something I'd been carrying for a long time finally being set down. When you've done the work, when you've been honest with yourself about what you're seeing and why, when you've been careful and thorough and fair, the moment of truth doesn't feel like a confrontation, it feels like an accounting. Everything that happened after was just the ledger coming out even. That's what Raymond never understood. The outcome wasn't something I did to him. It was the result of what he chose to do, playing out to its natural end.